Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
What if the history you were taught about the first people of the Americas was incomplete or even deliberately distorted? What if, long before Columbus set foot on the shores of the so-called New World, there were already ancient black civilizations flourishing across the Americas? History is often written by the victors, and in the case of pre-Columbian America, much of what we know has been filtered through a Eurocentric lens. But indigenous oral traditions, archaeological discoveries, and historical accounts challenge the mainstream narrative, revealing that African-descended peoples may have played a far greater role in shaping the Americas than previously acknowledged. The story of the Black Native Americans is one that has been obscured by time, colonization, and the erasure of inconvenient truths. From the Olmec civilization, whose colossal stone heads bear unmistakable African features, to the accounts of African sailors who reached the Americas centuries before Columbus, the evidence suggests a far more complex and diverse history than most textbooks tell. Yet this history is not just about African presence. It is also about the indigenous black populations of the Americas, whose identities and cultures were systematically erased or assimilated into other groups through centuries of conquest and forced migration. This article will explore the hidden history of the ancient black natives of America, drawing from a wealth of historical, anthropological, and linguistic sources. We will examine the genetic evidence, oral traditions, and artifacts that support this narrative and confront the uncomfortable question, why has this history been buried? By the end of this journey, you may find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about the first peoples of the Americas. The presence of black people in the Americas before European colonization is a topic of heated debate, but it is not without substantial evidence. Some of the most compelling clues come from ancient sculptures, linguistic traces, and the oral histories of indigenous groups themselves. The Olmec civilization, one of the earliest and most influential cultures in Mesoamerica, left behind enormous stone heads, many of which have distinctly African facial features, including broad noses and full lips. Some scholars argue that these sculptures depict African travelers who arrived in the Americas long before Columbus. The idea that Africans reached the Americas in pre-Columbian times is supported by numerous historical sources. The Egyptian scholar al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, spoke of African explorers who set sail across the Atlantic. The accounts of Abu Bakr, a 14th-century Malian emperor, describe a fleet of ships that disappeared across the ocean, never to return. Christopher Columbus himself recorded in his journals that he encountered dark-skinned people in the Caribbean who had traded with Native Americans long before his arrival. But beyond the question of African migration lies an even deeper mystery: the existence of black indigenous peoples who were already present in the Americas before any external contact. These groups, whose histories have been largely erased, include the dark-skinned Californios, the Caribs of the Caribbean, and various other indigenous groups whose descriptions in early European records suggest African-like features. The arrival of European settlers in the Americas marked the beginning of a massive campaign of cultural genocide, in which the identities of black indigenous peoples were deliberately erased. Many were classified as African slaves, even if they were native to the land, while others were forced to assimilate into newly created racial categories that fit the colonial agenda. Historical records reveal that many Native American tribes intermarried with runaway African slaves, leading to the formation of black Indian communities. However, these communities were often denied recognition in official histories. The Dawes Rolls, the federal government's registry of Native Americans, frequently excluded black Indians from tribal membership, reinforcing a racial divide that served the interests of white settlers seeking to appropriate indigenous lands. The suppression of black Native history was not just a matter of bureaucratic record-keeping. It was an intentional act of erasure. Many oral histories that spoke of black ancestors were dismissed as myths, while academic institutions failed to acknowledge evidence that contradicted the established narrative. The result is a deep-rooted misconception that Native Americans were a homogeneous group with no African lineage, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. One of the most intriguing aspects of this lost history is the linguistic evidence that suggests African influences in indigenous languages. Researchers have noted similarities between Mesoamerican languages and African tongues, particularly in phonetic structures and vocabulary. Some tribes also retain oral traditions that speak of dark-skinned ancestors who came from distant lands, bringing knowledge of navigation, agriculture, and metallurgy. Cultural practices further support this connection. Some indigenous groups in South America and the Caribbean practice rituals, hairstyles, and musical traditions that closely resemble those of African cultures. The construction of pyramids, the use of drum-based communication, and even specific religious beliefs align closely with traditions found in West Africa, suggesting a shared or interconnected history. The erasure of Black Native history is not a coincidence. It is the result of deliberate policies aimed at controlling the narrative of America's past. Acknowledging the existence of Black indigenous peoples disrupts the simplistic racial categories that have been used to justify land theft, slavery, and systemic discrimination. If history recognized that Black people were among the first inhabitants of the Americas, it would challenge deeply entrenched myths about who belongs and who does not. Moreover, the recognition of Black Native history poses a direct challenge to the colonial foundations of American identity. If Africans and indigenous peoples were already thriving in the Americas before Columbus, then the entire justification for European conquest, built on the idea that the land was uninhabited or underdeveloped, falls apart. It is no wonder that this history has been obscured, rewritten, or ignored. The story of the Black natives in America is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a vital piece of the puzzle that explains the full complexity of the American past. It is a history of resilience, resistance, and survival in the face of erasure. By uncovering and acknowledging this hidden legacy, we not only honor the ancestors who were written out of history, but also reclaim a more truthful and inclusive narrative of America's origins. It is time to challenge the lies and rediscover the truth. The presence of Black indigenous peoples in America is not a myth. It is a reality that demands recognition. And as new generations seek to understand their heritage, this long-buried history will continue to rise, forcing the world to confront the question, what if everything you knew was a lie?